As the evening settles in, let's travel back in time to 19th century Paris, a place where gas lamps flicker along grand boulevards, and the cobblestones echo with the clip of horse hooves, carriage wheels, and the persistent rustle of silk skirts and wool coats. You, of course, are not a noble tonight. You're a hat wearer. Because in this Paris, absolutely everyone is. If this story helped you relax even just a little, or bored you enough to make you sleepy, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Thank you for being here. Let the evening hush surround you. Find your calm, and together we'll step softly into the story ahead. You're trying to cross the Place de l'Opéra, but it's rush hour, or what passes for it when half the city seems to be promenading just to be seen. And they are all wearing hats. Big hats, small hats, feathered, veiled, beribboned, bejeweled monstrosities. Top hats so tall they make you squint. Boaters and bonnets, cloches and casquettes. Hats with names more complicated than most marriage contracts. You duck as someone's ostrich plume nearly slaps you in the eye. At this point in Parisian fashion history, roughly the 1850s to the 1890s, the hat is not optional. It's social armor. It signals your class, your mood, your political leanings. Some even claim your spiritual health is evident in the tilt of your brim. The city's sidewalks feel narrower each year, not because the streets are shrinking, but because hats are growing. You sidestep a well-dressed woman whose chapeau could double as a birdcage, complete with artificial nest. She doesn't notice you. She hasn't noticed a non-hat-related thing since 8 a.m. The popularity of hats is so intense that entire street corners become spontaneous hat showrooms. Young men linger near cafes in tilted straw boaters, showing off to whoever's watching from behind lace curtains. Children wear miniature replicas of their parents' hats, because of course they do. Even dogs, occasionally, get a novelty cap. You spot one now, a pug in a velvet bonnet, held in the arms of a woman whose own hat resembles a small shrubbery. There are reasons for this headwear explosion, most of them completely impractical. Industrialization, for one. The 19th century brought mass production to the fashion world. No longer were hats solely the domain of bespoke artisans. They were also churned out in factory lofts with gears and grime. You could walk into a department store like Le Bon Marché and walk out with a perfectly passable top hat made by someone you'd never meet. Fast fashion for the cranium. But while hats became easier to obtain, they didn't become simpler. On the contrary, they became increasingly absurd. This was the golden age of the chapeau ridicule. Some hats were made with actual taxidermied birds perched on top. Others had glass panels, rotating veils, or tiny stuffed mice, a short-lived trend, thankfully. Historians still argue whether one particularly notorious mechanized hat actually played music from a hidden crank inside the crown, or whether that's just a particularly persistent myth whispered by tired museum guides. And it wasn't just women. You, monsieur, if you're stepping out for a formal evening, must have your top hat brushed, your walking stick in one hand, gloves in the other. But the hat? That's what makes people step aside when you pass. The height of your hat roughly corresponds to the size of your bank account. Taller hats, higher tax bracket. You once saw a man nearly tip over when the wind caught his stovepipe hat on the Pont Neuf. He recovered, but his pride didn't. Then there's the problem of space. Hats need room. In carriages, people bump into each other like over-decorated mannequins. In cafes, waiters trip over discarded hat boxes. On staircases, wide-brimmed stiles scrape the wallpaper. leaving behind a trail of fabric flowers and passive-aggressive comments from the maid. Still, no one dares not wear one, not even indoors, not if you want to be seen. One little-known ordinance, briefly proposed by a disgruntled police prefect in 1867, would have required all hats wider than 18 inches to be registered. It was laughed out of the prefecture within the hour, but people still whisper about it with a certain wistful longing. Meanwhile, milliners, those overworked artisans of the hat trade, can barely keep up. You pass by their shops as twilight deepens. Inside, candlelight flickers across rows of velvet, feathers, and pins. Tiny hands sew through the night. Someone's ordering a hat shaped like a swan. Someone else wants a hat with a built-in mirror. You'd think this was satire, but no. This is Tuesday in Paris. And heaven help you if your hat falls out of fashion before its feathers molt. One year, the Parisians are all wearing pork pie hats. The next they've moved on to Gainsborough's. And suddenly yours is considered laughably provincial. You contemplate simply not wearing a hat tomorrow, just to see what happens. You might as well walk naked through the Tuileries. A man bumps into you, mutters something about your left-leaning brim, and disappears into the crowd. You realize, belatedly, that your hat's been slightly askew for most of the evening. Political statement? Or just poor posture? It's best not to speculate. You find yourself in a quieter alley now, tucked behind the wide boulevards where the serious hat business happens. Here, the scent of steam and starch drifts from the open windows of workrooms, mingling with the smell of warm bread from a nearby boulangerie. Welcome to the realm of the milliners and modistes, the magicians of millinery, the underpaid hands behind Paris's hat obsession. You knock softly on the back door of a modest atelier and are waved in by a girl no older than 15. She's threading tiny beads onto wire that will form the glistening spine of a hat designed to look like a sunbeam. She doesn't pause as she nods to you. This place runs on caffeine, gossip, and sore fingers. Inside, everything is motion. Hats in various stages of creation lie across tables, pinned like museum specimens. There's velvet from Lyon, silk from Tours, and feathers imported all the way from Java. One modiste mutters something about how a client requested an emotionally ambiguous bonnet. She's currently sewing a single red feather among the gray. Milliners are mostly women. Some work in established shops. Others run their own rooms, balancing fashion with rent. A few have even risen to fame, like Madame Viraud or Caroline Reboux, whose designs caused literal sidewalk pileups when debuted. Their hats appeared in magazines and on actresses, and once, scandalously, on the Emperor's mistress. They set the trends. The rest chase them. But it's not only the women. Men, too, have their own distinct world of headwear, and their own egos to match. You wander into a gentleman's hattery, where polished top hats are lined up like trophies on mahogany shelves. The shopkeeper, a man with a beard as upright as his collar, offers you a choice between semi-formal, fully dignified, or politically indifferent. Men's hats may appear simpler, but they come with just as many social rules. A bowler for every day, a Homburg for dignitaries, and the top hat, reserved for serious business or serious flirtation. The taller the hat, the more you're compensating. Or so the joke goes. Historians still argue whether the great top hat boom of the 1850s was a symptom of fashion, industrial steam molding techniques, or male insecurity. Possibly all three. What we do know is that men would rather walk barefoot in the street than be caught bareheaded at a dinner party. And yet, behind all the elegant ribbons and stiff brims is a ruthless trade. Hat shops engage in whisper campaigns, sending young assistants to spy on rival displays. There are even reports of design theft. One notorious case involved a disgruntled milliner posing as a client to sketch another's display, only to reproduce the same design across the river days later at half the price. Scandalous, if slightly impressive. You pause to watch a delivery boy dart by, balancing a tower of hat boxes that nearly obscure his face. He's headed toward the opera district, where the hats must match not just the gown, but the very area the client plans to be seen crying during. In Paris, fashion doesn't merely reflect the moment, it plans it. The obsession goes beyond design into science. Hat molds are made using careful measurements of head shape and size. Some elite clients have their own custom wooden heads kept in the atelier, labeled and shelved like rare wines. You're shown one now. Madame Lefebvre, 22.5 inches, prefers a slight tilt leftward for dramatic exits. But there's a dark side, too. Those beautiful feathers you admired earlier. Many are aigrettes, delicate sprays from egrets and other exotic birds, often taken during mating season when the plumes are most ornate. Entire colonies were wiped out to fuel Paris's obsession with looking whimsically windswept. A few voices raised concern, but they were drowned out by applause at the next fashion show. Hat fatigue begins to set in. Not yours, though your scalp is beginning to itch, but the city's. Too many hats, too many rules, too many shoulders bumped and egos bruised. And yet, no one stops. How could they? The milliners can't afford to slow down. Their livelihoods depend on keeping one absurd step ahead. Today, it's a hat with veil fringe and tassels. Tomorrow, it might be one with tiny wind chimes. Still, something is shifting. You can feel it in the quieter shops, where simpler straw boaters are being stacked near the entrance. A young apprentice leans against a window, watching a woman pass by in a modest felt cap. No feathers, no lace, just one elegant pin. But for now, the hat race continues. You tip your own hat to a passing stranger, who nods back solemnly, though you suspect his top hat is filled with bread to keep its shape. The things we do for appearances. You've made it into a drawing room, though not without difficulty. Your hat snagged twice on the frame of the carriage door, and once on the hem of someone else's hat as you exited. The salon is fragrant with lilac water and coffee, and you lower yourself carefully onto a brocade chair, trying not to crush the decorative pom-pom perched precariously on the back of your chapeau. You've survived the boulevard, the ateliers, and the fitting rooms. But now comes the true battlefield of 19th century Parisian hat culture, indoor etiquette. You can't just waltz into someone's parlor and keep your hat on. That would be uncouth, possibly even interpreted as a veiled insult depending on the host's mood, the day of the week, and the orientation of your feathers. But removing it isn't simple either. There's nowhere to put it. The hat stand by the door already groans under the weight of at least 8 structures that resemble miniature observatories. Yours teeters as you attempt to balance it atop the pile, and for a moment, the entire room holds its breath. Disaster is averted, barely. The social dance of hats indoors is so delicate, it might as well be choreographed. A gentleman must remove his hat as soon as he crosses the threshold, but never toss it on a side table, unless he wants to be remembered as that brute with the dusty brim. A lady may keep hers on if she is simply paying a call, but should she stay for dinner, it must come off. And heaven help her if she forgets to bring a hat pin to keep it safely anchored when not in use. Storage becomes a matter of quiet panic. Carriages don't come with drawers, and public cloakrooms are chaos. Some elite households employ a chapeaudier, a servant whose sole job is to manage guest hats during large events. These poor souls have to memorize whose feathered hat belongs to whom, like a bizarre upper-crust memory game. Lose a hat, and you might just lose a social connection, perhaps even a marriage proposal. And then, of course, there's the theater. Oh, the theater. Picture it. You're seated in your velvet chair, tickets paid for, excitement bubbling. And then someone in the row in front of you settles into place wearing a towering hat shaped like an exotic fruit basket. You try to peer around it. No use. The pineapple is blocking the stage. The problem got so bad that multiple Parisian theaters implemented hat removal rules in the 1880s, which were ignored with all the discipline of a hungry cat at a fish market. Theater ushers were enlisted to gently tap offenders on the shoulder, but many refused to comply. "My hat is the drama," one woman reportedly whispered during an intermission. Historians still argue whether the rise of collapsible hats, yes, collapsible, was partly in response to such complaints. These marvels of fashion engineering, often top hats, folded flat via hidden springs or hinges, allowing men to press them under their arms until needed. Handy in the opera house and slightly comedic when accidentally released. Beyond theaters, there were public transport concerns. Horse-drawn omnibuses grew increasingly crowded, and passengers often found themselves jousting with headgear instead of conversation. A satirical pamphlet from 1872 titled "Hats That Hate Us" lamented the daily assault of brims and bows upon our noses, eyes, and remaining patience. And we mustn't forget dining out. In cafes and restaurants, hats had to come off for space, but not too early, lest one seem overeager or unrefined. Leaving a hat on during dessert? Inexcusable. Removing it too quickly? Desperate. There were even illustrated guides on proper hat timing, though most people followed whatever their neighbor was doing and prayed no one noticed their confusion. You remember once being served an entire course of beef tongue while desperately holding your cumbersome feathered cap in your lap. You had no idea where to put it, and the waiter clearly didn't want to touch it. You dined in stiff silence, balancing fabric and social anxiety like an amateur acrobat. It wasn't only the elite who suffered. Even factory workers and maids had simpler, but still critical, hat considerations. Caps, kerchiefs, and bonnets weren't just fashionable. They signified roles, status, and duties. A maid caught without her lace-trimmed cap was considered improperly dressed and might be dismissed. A washerwoman's sunbonnet, if too wide, could provoke muttering from neighbors about pretensions. And in death, hats were still present. Mourning bonnets, heavily veiled and somber, were an entire subgenre of grief. Some widows wore black hats with a waterfall of crepe that trailed behind them like a shadow. Men wore formal mourning top hats with dull black bands. Your hat did not retire, even if you did. So it's little wonder that by the end of the 19th century, Parisians were exhausted. There were simply too many hats, in too many places, doing far too much. They took up space physically, mentally, and emotionally. And yet, removing them from the equation felt impossible. You stand now, brushing imaginary lint from your shoulders, The hostess is signaling the evening is over. Guests begin collecting their hat boxes and murmuring goodbyes. You find your own hat perched where you left it, miraculously untouched. You place it back on your head, tilt it just so, and prepare to step once more into the feathered velvet jungle that is Paris after dark. You step out into the cool Paris night, your hat casting a polite little shadow on the cobbled path. The gas lights flicker, as if uncertain whether to stay lit or surrender to the breeze, and around you, other figures begin their evening drift home. Every one of them, every single one, still wearing a hat. But something is shifting. You start noticing the cracks in the hat empire. A shop window once filled with towering confections of lace and felt now displays smaller, simpler caps. A well-dressed gentleman passes you in what used to be called a country hat, modest and unadorned. You hear snippets of conversation. A woman sighing about how her neck aches from balancing her new hat. A student griping that he couldn't find room to hang his at the university lecture hall. The hat saturation point has arrived, and with it, the pushback. Public satire, always one step ahead of fashion, starts sharpening its quills. You pick up a copy of Le Charivari, the humor paper, and chuckle at a cartoon of a man whose hat is so wide it has its own street address. Another depicts two women in a cafe, their hats so large they must speak via mirror signals. It's funny. It's also entirely plausible. The backlash isn't just in cartoons. Paris's shopkeepers begin grumbling. Hat boxes take up too much shelf space, and managing returns is a logistical nightmare. A cafe on the left bank begins quietly asking patrons to check their hats at the door. A theater goer pens an open letter complaining that her view of La Traviata was blocked by a hat more architectural than aesthetic. And in the midst of all this, fashion periodicals begin floating new ideas, smaller silhouettes, sleeker forms, perhaps even, gasp, no hat at all, if you're feeling very bold. Historians still argue whether the decline of elaborate hat culture was due more to changing tastes, the rise of practicality, or the beginning of modern transportation. Try fitting an ostrich plume bonnet inside an automobile. But the signs are all around. The wild hat years are winding down. Not without resistance, of course. Some designers double down. In a last flamboyant gasp, they unveil entire miniature gardens atop hats. Fountains, fake butterflies on wires, tiny ceramic busts of Voltaire. You stand before one in a department store, momentarily unsure whether it's headwear or a museum exhibit. The saleswoman assures you it's both, but others know the tide is turning. They start using softer fabrics. Flat caps gain popularity among working-class Parisians, and then, inevitably, among the upper class, who rebrand them as rustique chic. A strange little reversal unfolds. Modesty becomes the new extravagance. Even the legal world joins in. In 1898, a city councilman jokingly proposes a hat tax based on square inches, meant to curb the growing absurdity. It's never seriously considered, but the mere fact it was raised in session tells you everything about the cultural climate. Too many hats, too many problems. And yet, you feel a pang of nostalgia. The era of glorious, nonsensical, gravity-defying hats gave the city texture, color, drama. Entire romances began with a glance from beneath a carefully positioned brim. Rivalries started with a feather too many. You remember the sound of hat pins clinking in shops, the hush of velvet when lifted from a box, the thrill of someone turning to admire your silhouette in a mirror. You wander down a quieter street now, the lights thinning out. A man doffs his bowler hat politely as you pass, and you nod in return. There's something sweet in the gesture. Not all hats are disappearing. Some, you suspect, are becoming rituals rather than fashion statements. A child runs by, wearing a paper hat folded from a newspaper. A mother chuckles and lets her bonnet slip back onto her shoulders. A man ahead of you is holding his top hat loosely by the brim, not wearing it, just carrying it. All of Paris seems to be slowly, delicately exhaling. And then, one last surprise. In a small park square, you see a woman standing very still. She's wearing a modest straw hat. Nothing about it is grand. No pearls, no birds, no tulle, but it fits her perfectly. She catches you staring and gives the faintest smile. Not because you're rude, but because you're remembering the time when hats ruled Paris, when a street could come alive with nothing more than felt, ribbon, and a particularly aggressive rose cluster. You tip your own hat slightly in acknowledgement. She returns the gesture. And then, as softly as a passing breeze, you both move on. And now, as the lamps dim across the sleepy boulevards of the past, you let your thoughts slow with them. The noise of fashion and feathers fades, replaced by the quiet hush of soft footsteps along moonlit cobblestones. The hats, so heavy, so elaborate, so joyfully excessive, have been set down. Their silhouettes rest in closets and on dusty shelves, no longer demanding attention, simply existing like memories in the attic of history. You picture the old millinery shops, dark now, the last candle snuffed out, ribbons curled into stillness. The apprentices have long gone home. The spools are quiet. A feather drifts to the floor, undisturbed. There's nothing left to stitch tonight. You feel the gentle weight of sleep settle on your shoulders, lighter than the finest straw hat. The rules of etiquette soften, dissolve, disappear entirely. No more brim angles to worry about. No more space wars in cafes. Just calm, stillness. The simplest form of fashion. Rest. Paris lies quiet around you now. The Seine flows silently under her bridges. Somewhere, a hat forgotten on a bench sits perfectly still, catching starlight in its folds. No one rushes to claim it. It belongs to the night. Let your breath deepen. Let the past blur at the edges. There's no need to remember where you left your hat. In this gentle darkness, you don't need one. Sleep now. Let dreams take the shape of soft velvet and warm laughter. Tomorrow, the hats may rise again, but not yet. Not tonight.